Okay. All right, let's wait a minute. Okay, I think we can start. I apologize about the technical difficulties, but this is a very nice room too, and there are still seats. If somebody's looking for a seat, there is one here, and so you can take that one seat. Okay, so welcome to the annual Will Lyons lecture. The Department of Economics has a lecture fund that was established in the honor of Will Lyons, who's one of the founding members of the economics department. And every year we're able to use that fund to bring interesting speakers to campus to talk to us about important economic issues. As Professor Lyons was a Keynesian economist, our speakers are usually economists who also work in the Keynesian tradition. Our speaker this year is Randal Wray from the University of Missouri in Kansas City and the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College. He's a well-known post-Keynesian economist, and he's a founder of the school Modern Money Theory. Some of you may know that, especially if you took Money and Banking with me, or 103, or Macro for that matter. Professor Wray is also my dissertation advisor and my former professor. Now you know why you have to read so many Wray articles in your course, in the courses that you take with me. When I was a graduate student, I was working with Professor Wray as a research assistant, and one of the projects that he was working in 2008, 2009 was on the Euroland, and things weren't looking that bad in Euroland back then. The US was going through the crisis. The financial crisis was just, picking up steam here, and it seemed like things were going just fine in Europe. And Professor Wray's paper was titled, "Can Euroland Survive?" And, I was a research assistant, and I thought he was exaggerating a little bit. He was being a little bit too pessimistic about, what was going to happen in Euro. Can Euro survive? I thought that was, not even a question then. But of course, it's 2015, and the faith of the Euro is still hanging in the balance as countries like Greece and Spain are going through some difficult times, a Great Depression of their own in some ways, with very high unemployment rates and very extremely high youth unemployment rates. Okay, so I don't want to tell you any more about the European crisis. Professor Wray will do that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming back Professor Wray to FNM.
Okay, thanks. It's good to see a good turnout here. I gave a talk here a few years ago. I don't remember how many years ago it was. Hopefully, not many of you were students back then, so you're not going to have to listen to me twice. At that time, one of my other favorite students, Pavlina, was here, and she's now up at Bard, so I get to see her frequently. So I am going to talk about Euroland, although I'm not going to go deeply into details on the development of the crisis day by day. You know that Greece is in the news all the time now. I'm giving you a more general perspective on what's wrong with the euro, and it's also a way to bring in modern money theory. So I want to explain what's wrong with the euro from a modern money theory perspective. So to find out what's wrong with the EMU, we need to understand what money is all about. And so I'm going to be talking about sort of what is the nature of money and what is the relationship between a national government and its money. In the United States, of course, it's the dollar. In Euroland, it is now the euro. So we need to understand the nature of money to really understand what is going wrong in Euroland. And money is a very difficult topic. It's also very scary, and it makes people very angry. I wrote the first book, my first attempt anyway, to present modern money theory. I finished the book in '98. It actually took me a number of years to finish it. And I had sent a draft manuscript to the great economist, one of the greatest economists, Robert Heilbroner. I hope all of you do read some Heilbroner here. I wanted to see, would he write a blurb for the book? And he didn't know who I was, of course, at the time. Everyone knew who he was. He actually called me on the phone, and he said, he had the most soothing voice, and I know some of the older people here probably did hear him speak, and I can't replicate that, but he said, I can't write a blurb for this book. He said, you're writing a book on money, and money is the scariest topic there is, and your book is going to scare the hell out of everybody, so I can't write a blurb. He said, it's not because I disagree. He said, it's just too scary to touch this topic. So anyway, it's going to be scary, and maybe some of you have heard a little bit of modern money theory. And when people first hear it, they do go through several different stages, and one of those is anger. The problem with Euroland has to do with the setup of the monetary system, okay? It has really nothing to do with profligate Mediterraneans who can't save and spend more than their incomes. That's not the problem in Europe. The problem is not trade imbalances, okay? There are trade imbalances, I will talk about that, but that really is not the fundamental problem. The problem is not lack of structural reform. So as you might know, in the last few days, Greece has been told, well, we'll help you a little bit, but you have to engage in massive structural reforms, privatize everything, break up labor unions, and so on. That's not the problem. And finally, the problem is the design of the euro, and Yeva mentioned 2008 or whatever. We did write a paper together, but this was obvious from the very beginning when Godley, who I will mention a little bit later, wrote an article about the problem with Euroland that was absolutely right in 1992. So it could be seen even before the euro was adopted as the currency for Euroland. It was obvious if you understood the nature of money. If you didn't understand the nature of money, you couldn't possibly see this crisis coming. So how is money usually introduced in classes? Before you see what I show next, I'm sure you've all seen this, and this is the way that you probably were initially taught, at least in the textbook, hopefully not by your professors. We had Robinson Crusoe. He discovers Friday. He colonizes Friday, actually. And they start bartering fish for corn. So Crusoe brings corn, he becomes the farmer, and Friday catches fish, and they barter. Barter is inconvenient. You need what economists call a double coincidence of wants, okay? You have to find somebody who wants what you have produced because they don't have it. And you have to want what they produce because you don't have it. So barter is a very inefficient way to run a market economy. So what they do is they look around for something they can use as a medium of exchange. Maybe they start with seashells or something like that, but eventually they settle on, of course, gold. Okay, why? Because gold has special properties. One is it's bright and shiny. Everybody wants gold, right? Because it's an attractive commodity to own. But it has other special features that make it convenient to use as money. It's very valuable in very small quantities. So you don't have to carry a whole bunch of seashells. You can carry a tiny bit of gold. It's infinitely divisible. You can chop it up into and hammer it out into extremely tiny pieces, okay? So that you could buy one fish at a time rather than buying 1,000 fish with a bar of gold. So it has nice features. One problem with gold is it's so valuable, you got to protect it. Okay, so one of the disadvantages of moving from barter to using an intermediate good is that if that good is extremely valuable, it's subject to thievery. Fortunately, you had goldsmiths. Goldsmiths would turn gold into jewelry and other art objects. And goldsmiths were used to protecting their gold. So they could hold your gold for safekeeping, okay? Lock it up in safes. Now, the goldsmiths came to realize that they can issue receipts against the gold that they hold, and they discovered that you don't get everybody coming in on the same day to demand their gold back. So they start issuing extra receipts. Okay? Those receipts can circulate as the medium of exchange. So you don't actually have to use the gold, you can keep it locked away. And you can instead use receipts for gold as your money. All right? And the goldsmith discovers what we now call the deposit expansion process. You can multiply the amount of money by issuing more receipts than you have gold. And so that is where banks come from. So this is the story that's been handed down generation after generation. And it's sort of an origin story, which may or may not be true, okay? But it's also a story that gets at a nature of money, okay? That is, money is a medium of exchange. And that is the way that most economists approach money. The nature is all about the use as a medium of exchange. And because we are multiplying the amount of gold that's backing up the money, the problem is if you issue too many of those receipts, then you get inflation, okay? And so if you get too much of the medium of exchange issued, you can get inflation. So the focus is all on this. Okay, now let me start to develop an alternative approach to money, which has one big advantage. It actually fits the historical record, which the other does not at all. There's absolutely no evidence that there was any market economy ever based on barter. There's no evidence that money came out of barter as an efficiency enhancing innovation of Friday and Crusoe. There's no evidence in favor of that. There's a very nice book by Graeber, which you can read. He's an anthropologist, and he's looked through all the history. I had done that on my own, but he did a much more thorough job. There's no evidence for that story at all. The story I'm going to tell you, there is evidence, okay? When archaeologists dig up artifacts that come from periods before there was writing, it's very difficult to determine what the artifacts are, okay, other than obvious things, okay, drinking utensils and so on, okay? So archaeologists have dug up this stone, upper left-hand side. It has some scratches on it. I hope you can see it from your seat. Okay. What are they? We don't know. They're hash marks. Why did some early human, this is about 500,000 years old, 500,000 years ago, some human made scratch marks on a rock. Took some effort. Why did he do it, or she? We don't know, okay? Go to the upper right-hand side. These are bones. These are much newer. These are 50,000 years old, okay? Much more complicated. Maybe you can't tell, but there's a whole bunch of hash marks in the bones. What are they? We don't know. It sure looks like somebody is keeping track. It looks like a record of some kind. What were they recording? We don't know. Okay. Let's move down to the ball. Okay, this is a bit over 5,000 years old. There are holes in the ball through which somebody pushes tokens. The tokens are spread out on the right-hand side. What are they? Well, we know a fair amount about these because these tokens represented things like a goat, a sheep, a horse, okay? Because much later, well, not too much later, they discovered that rather than pushing the tokens into the balls, we can push the tokens into a clay tablet and keep the record that way. That way we can use one token over and over and over again. If it's 5 sheep, you push it in the clay 5 times. And that leads to the clay Shubati tablets, which we can read, we know exactly what they say. Okay, 5,000 years ago. This was the invention of writing. As far as we know, writing was invented to keep track of monetary contracts, contracts in money terms, money as a unit of account. So we can read these. The earliest evidence of writing is all about recording money values. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us first, money is older than writing. We're never going to dig up out of the ground somebody's diary where he says, today I invented money. And this is why I did it, and this is how I did it. We'll never discover that. Money existed before writing. Okay. So that's why we're not going to really know the origins of money, but it certainly does not seem to be consistent with the barter story, okay? Because as far as we can tell, money came out of, was invented by, not Robinson Crusoe and Friday, but by authorities. Okay? In the beginning, probably religious authorities, and later civil authorities. And money was invented not to facilitate exchange, but to keep accounts. Money was first a money of account. I would like to go into this in much more detail, but I had 45 slides when I started, and we've only gone through a couple, and I'm going to have to try to finish this. So in question and answer, if you want to know more about the history, I can do that. Okay, moving on. Well, this is the American Indian wampum belts, but I wanted to point out the tally sticks here. Maybe you've heard of tally sticks. You've heard the term in English, raise a tally. When the King of England wanted to fight a war, he would raise a tally. What did he do? He got hazelwood sticks. They put notches across them, very much like the bones that are 50,000 years old. Put notches across them, and then split them down the middle. You've heard the term stock and stub. One is a stock, one is the stub. The king would keep one in the treasury, one half, and the other half he spent. Okay, spent into the economy to provision the army. At tax time, the taxpayers would bring their half of the stick. And the treasurer for the king would match the two to make sure you didn't counterfeit. What would counterfeit mean? Put more hashes in to claim that it was worth more. Okay? Matched them. Matched the stock and stub. Once he receives back the tally stick, the taxes have been paid. So most people have this idea that throughout Europe, gold coins were the main means of payment and medium of exchange. Actually, most spending by the crown and most taxes collected were in the form of tally sticks until very recently. In fact, in England, the king was still collecting taxes in tally sticks until 1840s. That's when they finally abolished the tally sticks. The people who worked in the treasury were so happy they didn't have to match stock and stub anymore. They threw them all into the fire and burned down Parliament. There's a very famous painting by Turner that shows the burning of the Houses of Parliament by the people who worked in the Exchequer, who were so glad they didn't have to collect any more tally sticks. Okay? So, an alternative view. The term modern money, which I used in the '98 book, actually comes from John Maynard Keynes. Everyone knows the general theory, but he had already written a very important 2-volume book called The Treatise on Money, which actually goes into much more detail on the nature of money and the history of money, the origins of money, and so on. And he, I think, mostly gets it right in the sense that what Keynes had said so long ago, 1930, has been confirmed by the anthropological and archaeological evidence that we have gotten since the 1930s. Okay, so he said, for the past 4,000 years at least, we've had modern money. Okay? So what I'm going to describe now is how money has worked for the past 4,000 years, at least, according to Keynes. And that's about right. Okay? Now, why can we be pretty sure about the past 4,000 years? Writing. Okay? We don't really know before that. It could be true, the barter story could be true, okay? We don't know. But what we do know, for the past 4,000 years, it's been nothing like the barter story, okay? For the past 4,000 years at least, money has been a state monopoly. The state chooses the money of account, almost without exception, all the way back for 4,000 years and all across the globe today. Okay? There are a few exceptions, but they are very, very few, and they're generally not very important. Okay? By far the most important situation is one in which the state chooses the money of account. The dollar in the United States, the yen in Japan. Okay? The state chooses the money of account. It's a representation of social value. It's a representative money. Representative. Dollar. Okay, you cannot touch it. You cannot see it. It's a representative money. Now, I know in America we have a confusion because if I say dollar, you might think, oh, is that the unit of account? Or did he mean the green piece of paper? Okay, because we use the term for both. For the green piece of paper, which does have a physical existence, you can touch it, you can see it, you can smell it, you could eat it, I guess. Okay? But we also have dollar that's purely representational, the money of account. The state chooses the money of account. Okay? Then there are many things that you actually can touch and feel that people will say that it is a dollar. Okay? And of course, it goes way beyond the green pieces of paper. You have probably a bank account. What's it denominated in? Dollars. If I ask you how many dollars do you have in your bank account, you could tell me with some error. Okay? I have $5,000 in my bank account. What form do they take? Well, they're probably not green pieces of paper. They're electronic entry. I always say electronic, but engineers tell me they're photons. I don't know which. It's either electrons or photons. Okay? What are these really? They're records. Just like the slashes on the bone are records, the slashes on tally sticks are records, the tokens pressed into clay are records, records that are denominated in the money of account. Every one of these records is actually an IOU. Your bank account, in which you have $5,000 recorded in photons, is a record of what? Of what the bank owes you. Your demand deposit or checking account is an IOU of the bank. What about the green piece of paper? It's a record of an IOU. Who owes you? Anyone know? Close. There we go. The Fed. Now, we used to have treasury paper in the United States, and probably there is still some out there, but now it would be framed on somebody's wall, okay? And we do have a treasury IOU, right? What is it? Okay, I'm thinking about something you might put in your pocket. Coins. The coins are the Treasury's IOU. Okay? They're all IOUs. The bills and bonds are IOUs. Okay, we can think of those all as being records, okay, of how much some entity owes you, the Fed, your bank, the Treasury, okay, denominated in dollars in the United States. What backs it up? When I first started teaching in the early 80s, I would ask my students in money and banking, what backs up the dollar? 90% would say gold. It wasn't even true in 1980. Okay? We went off gold in the early 70s. There's no gold backing up dollars. I'm sure that all of you knew that there's no gold backing up dollars. Okay? We went off that. So you can take out a paper dollar and see what it promises. And on the US dollar it says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. I always like to see what it says on currencies. Canadian dollar, very similar. Australian dollar, very similar. UK pound, if you happen to have one, take it out and look at it. There's a picture of the Queen, and the Queen says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. She doesn't say you can use this for anything. She says, if you bring this £5 note to me, I will give you a £5 note. She's not going to give you gold. Okay? She doesn't say you can use it as legal tender. She just says, bring it to me, I'll give you another £5 note. You don't like that one, I'll give you another one. Okay? So a lot of people say this is a fiat money. There is nothing backing it up. There's nothing behind the dollar. That's Greenspan, if you've forgotten who this guy is. This is Alan Greenspan. There's nothing backing the dollar up. Okay? Does that mean the dollar is worthless? Not at all. Okay. The use of currency and value of money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on the intrinsic value. You don't need gold backing. You can use otherwise worthless pieces of paper, or photons, or tally sticks, or bones, or clay, okay, to record the value. They are records of debts. They're a promise to redeem. When the Queen says, I will pay you £5, what she really should say is, if you bring this £5 note to me, I will accept it and you are redeemed. Okay? Those notes are actually ways to redeem yourself. It's redemption. If you send that dollar back, okay, technically it's going to go first to the Fed, but then it's the Treasury that gets the credit. You've redeemed yourself. Of what? An obligation to pay a tax, an obligation to pay the state. Okay? That's what money actually is all about. I'll say more about that. It's a promise to redeem. The state played a central role in the evolution of money for the past 4,000 years at least. Before that, we can't say for sure. But for the modern money period, 4,000 years, the state played the major role. What we almost always find as we go back through history and as we go around the world today is, Charles Goodhart called it the one nation, one currency rule. In other words, every nation has its own currency. Okay? It is sometimes violated, but not very often. Until the development of the euro, there really were no major exceptions. There were some minor exceptions. The Vatican used the lira. Okay? Didn't have its own currency. But they were exceptions. Goodhart argued the separate currencies are not a coincidence. It's tied up with sovereign power, political independence, and fiscal authority. What happened when the Soviet Union broke up? Every new state, every new country chose a new currency. They didn't keep the old currency. Okay, and this is typically the case. If a country divides in half, each side will get a new currency. because it's all tied up with sovereign power. Without your own currency, as we'll see, you don't have sovereign power. And then finally, as a shorthand, we say in this alternative approach, the modern money theory approach, taxes drive money. Ultimately, what stands behind the currency is an obligation to pay the state. An obligation to pay the state. And what do you pay the state? You pay the state its own IOUs. Why do you accept worthless pieces of paper? Because you can use them to pay taxes. Why would you accept these tally sticks from the king, who comes in and says, I need some goats to provision the army? Why would you trade your goats for sticks? Because you owe taxes. And later you can pay your taxes by delivering back the half of the tally stick that you received. So the state imposes this obligation, taxes. It does not have to be taxes, it just has to be an obligation to pay. Fees, fines, tithes all work too. And in fact, taxes are only the past 200 years. Have taxes been important before that? It was fees and fines and tithes and tribute were the important payments you had to make. And then the state accepts its own money thing, IOU, record of the state's debt in payment of the taxes. How does a modern government spend? They don't put hash marks on tally sticks. They don't push tokens into clay. Okay? They do it by keystrokes. Most government spending is by keystrokes. They keystroke bank accounts. Okay? The government credits a bank's reserves. It's actually the Fed in the United States that credits the bank reserves. And the bank credits the account of the recipient of government spending. If you sold something to the government, you get a credit. If you are a retiree and Social Security makes the payment, you get a credit. Okay? So it's just a credit to your bank account. How about taxing? Taxing just reverses that. The government debits your account. Technically, the Fed will debit your bank's reserves, and your bank will debit your bank account when you pay taxes. You might write a check, or you might do the electronic payments. What does that mean? What happens if the government spends more than it taxes? That means it has credited more bank accounts than it debited. That means there have been net credits to the banking system. That means the non-government sector has received net credits. They receive more than they paid in taxes. So some of the bank deposits that have been created and some of the bank reserves that were created still remain after the taxes are paid. Okay? So what is a deficit? Net credits to the non-government sector. Policy implications. Can the government run out of keystrokes? Not if you have at least one person in the Treasury who has one finger left, they can always push a key on the keyboard. They can always credit bank accounts. Social Security recipients will always receive all the payments that they are due, as long as there's one person in the Treasury who can push that button. Can't run out of keystrokes. Okay, Bernanke was asked this. Where's all that money that you got to bail out the banks? Was that taxpayer money? He said, no, it wasn't taxpayer money. We keystroked it. It was all keystrokes. Okay? And he was being completely honest and correct. Okay? Unusual, but in this particular case, honest and correct, that it was all keystrokes. That's where they came from. What that means is government can always afford to buy anything for sale. I told you this was going to be scary because the government can always afford to buy anything that's for sale. If it's for sale in dollars, the U.S. government can afford to buy it. Always. Cannot run out of keystrokes. If you're willing to sell something for dollars, the U.S. government can afford to buy it. And what that means in particular, what's really important is unemployment is always a policy failure. Always, without exception. If there's any unemployment in the United States, our government has failed us. Because the government can always afford to hire the unemployed. Always. Can't run out. President Obama says all the time he ran out of money. This is false. He's either misinformed or dishonest. One of the two. Okay, there's no other possibility. Cannot run out of money. The only economic constraints the government faces are full employment of resources. Beyond full employment, you can't hire more labor. Okay? You have to take it away from some other use, which may not be a good idea. And secondly, inflation, which will always happen if you're beyond full employment. The economy is already operating beyond full employment and the government spends more, you will get inflation. You can also get inflation before full employment, depending on what you're trying to buy and what the elasticity of production in the particular sectors you're trying to buy from might be. All other constraints on government are political constraints. In the US, we have a political constraint called the debt limit, which we're going to reach again very soon, and we're going to have another big debate in Congress where the Republicans are going to insist that we got to cut back spending or they will not approve an increase of the debt limit. Okay, this is politics, has nothing to do with economics, has nothing to do with government being able to afford to spend more. Okay, finally, with the background, we can now get to the Eurozone crisis. Okay, the financial crisis in Euroland is actually very similar to the financial crisis in the United States. It was driven by an out-of-control financial sector, private financial sector, and that excess debt morphed into an alleged sovereign debt crisis. So the problem began in the private sector, and then it brought down governments with it. Some of the countries currently called irresponsible were the role models of fiscal discipline until the financial crisis hit, especially Ireland and Spain. Both of those countries had governments that actually ran budget surpluses until the crisis hit. And then they tried to save their banks. And that's how the government got deeply into debt. Now, Greece is a bit different. They were running budget deficits before the crisis hit. So the real problem was excessive private sector debt and lax lending by banks, and that should sound like deja vu because that was exactly the US problem. However, we bailed out our banks. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, we did. Okay? And we got a sort of recovery. We're certainly in much better shape than Euroland. So what was Europe's problem? The real problem was the EMU, the way they had set up their monetary system. It was designed to fail, as I said, predicted long ago by people who understood what money really is all about. And when budget deficits were created in these countries, they actually faced market discipline. In the United States, we had a $1 trillion budget deficit. Markets didn't discipline us at all because we have a sovereign currency. Here's a graph. The PowerPoint will be available, so I'll go through these quick so we can get finished. You can study these later, but I just wanted to show the red line is the Maastricht criteria. You're not supposed to have a budget deficit greater than 3% of GDP, so that'll be a negative because it's a deficit. You can see that most countries were around or even above that. That is, had a deficit less than 3% of GDP until the crisis hit, and then we fall off a cliff, okay? So it was the crisis that really caused the deficits to explode. Same story with the debt. Here we have the debt line actually drawn at 100% of GDP. Maastricht said 60%. So you can also look at the 60% line. You can see that, yes, okay, it's true. We had two countries that were around 100%, which already is breaking the rules, but it's not at a line at all for a sovereign country to have a debt ratio of 100% of GDP. But it's when the crisis hits that we see most countries spiking up their debt ratios because of the crisis. And finally, you hear especially with respect to the Greek problems that it's because their social system is so extravagant. People get welfare checks, and they can retire when they're really young, and they get really generous benefits from the government, and that's why nobody wants to work, and that's the source of their problem. You can compare Greece with, say, Germany, which is supposed to be, very tough on welfare and all that. Germany is actually much more generous than Greece is. Okay, that story is not true. This graph shows selected countries, the government debt ratio of GDP on the left-hand side, and the private sector debt ratio on the right-hand side. And I know it will be hard for you to read this from your seats, so you can look at it later. But you do notice sort of a pattern here. The countries with small government debt ratios, the ones up towards the top, have big private sector debt ratios. The countries with big government debt ratios tend to have small private sector debt ratios. Isn't that kind of strange? Is it strange that the countries where the government seems to be doing the right thing, keeping the debt ratio low, the private sector is borrowing like crazy, and vice versa? Well, it's not a coincidence at all. Finally, I just wanted to show you that the US and the EMU actually look very similar in terms of what the private sectors were doing. They were bubbling. It was bubbles are us. Okay, Babylonia. Okay, going deeply into debt to fuel real estate bubbles. Okay, happened both places. Okay, so they're very similar to us. Clearly, Euroland would have had a financial crisis, just like we had a financial crisis. Okay, but here we are in 2015. They can't recover. They can't recover because they don't have the government with the fiscal capacity to allow them to recover. So what happened in Euroland is the countries that gave up their own currencies to join the EMU adopted what essentially was a foreign currency called the euro, a foreign currency. They became a lot like US states, and this is exactly the way we analyzed it a long time ago. We said, oh, when Italy gives up the lira and adopts the euro, they become just like Mississippi. They become just like Mississippi. They're no longer sovereign. They don't have the fiscal capacity to deal with social spending if a recession hits, or to bail out their banks, because they don't have the sovereign currency anymore. Okay. They become users of the currency, not issuers. So they will be constrained in by their tax revenue, their bond sales, and ultimately the willingness of the ECB to lend to them. When they get in trouble, they're going to have to rely on the ECB, because they don't have the capacity to just create as many euros as they need. Their problem was that unlike Mississippi, they don't have Uncle Fritz who's going to bail them out. When the financial crisis hit the US, you know that American banks have headquarters in particular states, right? When the crisis hits and Bank of America gets in trouble, who bails them out? The state where they're headquartered or Washington? Choose one. Washington bails them out. The states didn't have to do that. Okay? When you need more social spending to take care of the unemployed who've lost their jobs and who maybe retire early and go on Social Security or go on disability, who picks up a major part of that cost? Uncle Sam. In Euroland, what happened when the Irish banks failed? Ireland bailed them out. Spanish banks, Spain bailed them out. Uncle Fritz doesn't bail them out. They're each individually responsible for their own financial system and for the welfare of their population. When they tried to deal with that, they faced the problem of market discipline. I'll come to that in just a second. One of my colleagues at Kansas City actually wrote her dissertation, I think, around the late 90s. And one of her theses in the dissertation was, she called it convergence going in and divergence going out. What's going to converge? The interest rates. Going into the euro, the interest rates will converge. As the markets say, oh, you're all on euros now. You're not. Italy issuing lira, which we don't trust too much. You are now part of Europe, and you're issuing euro-denominated bonds. These are just as good as German bonds. They're in the same currency. Okay, and that's exactly what happened. All these rates are relative to German rates. Convergence. Greek bonds, interest rates, converged to the same interest rate as German bonds, give or take a little bit. Okay? But, Stephanie said, eventually markets are going to realize these are not. Greece didn't suddenly become Germany. Italy didn't become Germany. When markets realize that they're no longer sovereign and that the ECB by design is not supposed to bail them out, they are risky. They might default. They might leave the euro. Interest rates will diverge. So what happened when the financial crisis hit? Everyone's looking, uh-oh, I've got Greek bonds, I have Spanish bonds, I have Irish bonds, I don't have German bonds. Okay? Interest rates spiked. And you can see they go to extremely high levels. 10 percentage points higher than German bonds. At 10 percentage points higher, you are guaranteed to default. Guaranteed. Because countries cannot pay 12 or 13% interest on bonds. Okay? At least these countries can. Which is why we're where we are. The Greeks say the debt is not payable. And the Germans say, you must pay it. The Greeks say, but we can't pay it. Germans say, you must pay it. Okay, that's where we are right now. All right. Within Euroland, there's a problem in that each country is supposed to constrain its budget deficit. Okay? There is something called a three-sector balance. At the aggregate level, if we're talking about a country or even a currency used by a number of countries, it must be true that when you add up the either budget deficit or budget surplus across all three sectors, domestic private, government, and foreign sector, they have to sum to zero. Think of it this way. If you only have two people in your economy, Robinson Crusoe and Friday, if one of them runs a budget surplus, the other must be running a budget deficit. Because if you add up spending, it must equal income at the aggregate level. So this is true in any country, okay? And so in other words, if you're going to constrain your government's budget, let's say that you balance your budget. That means your private sector can save, in other words, have a surplus, only if you can run a current account surplus, which is almost the same thing, not exactly, but close, to a trade surplus. You need to export more than you import to allow your private sector to save. So Godley wrote that without an expansionary fiscal policy, real output can't grow for long because the private sector cannot create its own net financial assets. It can't accumulate net financial wealth if your government is not running expansionary policy and running deficits consistently, unless you happen to be a current account surplus country, okay? That's the only thing that can possibly save you. So I just wanted to first flash, and I want you to look at this later in detail, a picture of the United States, sectoral balances. So I always ask students, what's the first thing you notice? It is a mirror image. Isn't that funny? Balances do balance at the aggregate level. For every surplus, there is a deficit. If you study this, you will see The blue, which is the private sector, the blue almost always runs a budget surplus. The private sector saves. Okay? On the other hand, the government is always red. Red means in deficit. The government is almost always in red. The only exception was the 10 years before the financial crisis. The government actually ran a surplus during the Clinton years, killed the economy. Then we managed to recover only by the private sector borrowing even more until we finally collapsed. Okay? Let's go back to Euroland. Taken as a whole, Euroland looks pretty similar to the United States. The private sector here is red above the line. The private sector is always running surpluses. And green, the government is always running deficits at the aggregate level across all countries. And finally, the blue is the current account balance, and you can see it's tiny. It goes from surpluses to deficits, but it doesn't really matter. It's very small. In that way, it's unlike the US because we always run current account deficits. In Euroland, the current account doesn't really matter much if you take all of Euroland together. It matters a lot for individual countries. Most countries in Euroland run current account deficits. Only a few countries run current account surpluses. What if your current account is not in surplus? Can your private sector still achieve a surplus? Yes, but only if you have a budget deficit. That's the only way to do it. Within the Eurozone, the countries on the left are the current account deficit countries. These are the poor countries that are going to have a problem. Their private sector cannot save unless their governments run deficits because they have current account deficits. The lucky countries are the ones on the right. They have current account surpluses. Who's the big, really lucky country? Germany is the big lucky country. It has a very big current account surplus. That means its private sector can save and accumulate financial wealth even if the government doesn't run a budget deficit. Okay, Germany and the Netherlands are really the only two that are major exceptions to that. Virtually every other country in Euroland is running a current account deficit, which means their private sector is going to get in trouble unless their government runs a budget deficit. And you're not supposed to run budget deficits, and when a crisis hits, the markets are going to discipline you. Let's start in 1996. So we're forming the euro. We noticed that, wow, Italy and Ireland are both big current account surplus countries along with France, which is also fairly big. Germany is one of those countries that runs a current account deficit. Okay? I'm going to go through these fast because there's a lot of them, and all that matters is keep your eyes on these three countries that are surplus, and especially keep your eyes on green. Germany. Start from 1996. 97, 98, 99, 2000. There's probably never been an international agreement that so benefited one country. The EMU benefited Germany tremendously. Okay? They export to all the other countries within the EMU. And as you can see, countries that before actually were major industrial powers that exported to the rest of the world are now current account deficit countries. So within the Euroland, the euro is issued by the ECB, which sets the overnight rate and acts as a lender of last resort in a crisis, but it is not supposed to bail out a country's banks or bail out a government of a country. There is something called Target 2. I'd like to spend time talking about this because this allowed more slop in the system than we had initially thought. And it's the only thing really that has kept Euroland functioning as well as it is, because it allows a country like Greece or Italy to run current account deficits against Germany but still clear accounts between banks because the ECB is lending to Greece continually, huge amounts, lending to Italy, huge amounts, so that they can afford to buy German output. Okay? It's not to help their government, it's to ensure that they can still pay the Germans for the output that Germany is producing. Individual nations are users, not issuers. They have to earn or borrow euros. Their fiscal policy is ultimately constrained by the ECB, as we're finding out. So you have to please Germany and the ECB in order to get loans in order to keep the governments functioning. So the euro is the problem. By adopting the euro, sovereign nations have turned themselves into something like U.S. states. Unlike U.S. states, the euro governments have to fund their pensions and health care on their own rather than relying on Uncle Sam. Euro governments had to deal with the banking problems. In the U.S., the Fed, by the way, had to lend $29 trillion, you heard it right, it's with a T, trillion, to bail out the U.S. financial system. A long time ago, we looked at the U.S. state debt to GDP ratios, just to get an idea of what will markets allow a non-sovereign government to borrow. And it turns out it's maximum about 18% of GDP. All but one members of the euro, from the very beginning, were already way above this. Okay, think about Italy. Italy was 100% of GDP. No U.S. state is able to run a debt to state GDP ratio of 20% of GDP before the market says, you're not credit worthy, we're not going to lend to you anymore. So Wynne Godley said in 1992, the power to issue its own money, to make drafts on its own central bank, is the main thing which defines national independence. If a country gives up or loses this power, it acquires the status of a local authority, Mississippi, or a colony. Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland have all become colonies. Of whom? What are we going to do? There are basically two choices if we're going to try to save Euroland. One is that the ECB can explicitly fund the governments and just say something like, we will back up your debt, guarantee it, so that you can have a very low interest rate, equal to an amount of, say, 60% of GDP. Beyond that, you got to go to the markets. But up to some limit, we will back it up and fund it. If necessary, we'll buy it. If the markets won't take it at a very low interest rate, we'll buy it. Okay, that's one option. That gives them the fiscal space to run deficits as necessary. The other is to have the EU Parliament have a budget that's sort of equivalent to what the Washington budget is, so that Parliament would have the power to provide funding to nations when they need it, to fund social payments or job creation or infrastructure, whatever they need. The EU Parliament already does that. It's done it from the very beginning, but their total budget is less than 1% of GDP. Uncle Sam's total budget is well over 20% of GDP. So in the United States, the U.S. Treasury has more than 20 times as much to redistribute among the states as the European Parliament has to redistribute among the member nations. Okay, what would you need to do? Maybe 5% of total GDP distributed on a per capita basis. That gets a buy-in from every country. If Germany's going to get the money too, maybe they'll be more likely to accept this proposal. But it would be better if it's a progressive, where you give more to the poorer nations than to the rich nations. And you probably need a counter-cyclical component so that when times are bad, when a crisis hits, that could rise to, say, 10% in a recession. The alternative is to leave the euro, okay? And a lot of, within modern money theory, there are proponents of forget it, get out. Okay, so there are people recommending that Greece should just take the opportunity right now and leave. And there are others who think that The costs of that exit are very high, in part because of the agreements of the EMU, but also the agreements of the EU. It's not clear you can leave the EMU and stay within the EU. So the cost could be very high of leaving. I'm personally very skeptical that it would be worth that. The problem is, if you don't get that, you have to have one of these. Okay, otherwise the system is not workable. All right. I hope we have time for some questions. Anyone have any questions? Yep.
You talked about Germany running large surpluses, and I think it was a couple of years ago, perhaps fall 2013, that U.S. Treasury sort of made an official complaint to the German government about running these large current account surpluses. And because it's obviously a zero-sum game, so if they're, as you said, if they're running surpluses, somebody else is running deficits. And just last week, I've read in German media that they were celebrating as a really positive thing in their economy a new record high trade surplus, whereas that was kind of underrepresented everywhere else in the media in the U.S. and Britain. So do you think Germans should feel bad or like do something about kind of like trying to run a balanced current account or trade account, or that's just up to really good demand for their products that they make, and they shouldn't feel bad about it?
Yeah. So it's an extremely complex question. First, is a current account surplus a good idea for any country? Exports are a cost, imports are a benefit. If you're trying to maximize your current account surplus, you're maximizing costs, not benefits. So in a way, it's crazy. It's an absolutely crazy thing to do. Why would the Chinese want to work so hard so that Americans can consume their output? Wouldn't it be better for the Chinese to consume it? Okay, so that's one answer. But of course, the way the EU is set up, you need euros. How can you get euros? You export to people who have euros, which are other members of the EU. So by the rules of the game, Germany's winning. I wrote, who won? They're winning. It's the way the game has been set up. So in a way, you can understand what the Germans are saying. They say, look, here's the rule of the game. Have you ever played Monopoly? What's the rule of the game? Be the last one, right? Everyone else dies. They say, we're playing the rule of the game, and we won. Why is everyone mad at us? Okay? But by the rule of their game, it is just like Monopoly. Everybody else loses. Okay? It's not a sustainable game. Monopoly's not sustainable. It's absolutely inevitable. One person's going to win. Okay? And same with the euro. Eventually, Germany will lose, not to the other members. They're going to lose to China. Okay? They will lose to China. Their current account surplus will go away. And in fact, Germany will move that point forward as fast as they possibly can. They're going to build their factories in China. Okay? Exactly what Japan did. They're going to build the factories outside their country. That's capitalism, right? So in the end, it's not sustainable for Germany either. Right now, yes, they can produce the higher tech, and luxury items. China will catch up extremely fast. So China will start taking those away. Okay, so those are two different ways to go about answering it. But look, if you want Euroland to survive, then one solution would be to say that the country that's winning has to spend the surplus. So you must go take vacations in Greece. No matter how terrible it is, you have to go do this. Or you lose your surplus. We'll just take it away and give it to the Greeks. Okay, so this is Keynes's Bretton Woods plan, the banker plan. Okay, so that is a possible solution. But then think about it. Look at it this way. In the United States, okay, you're in Pennsylvania, I'm in New York. Does your state run a current account surplus against the rest of the United States? Nobody's answering. Does anyone here know? No. I could go anywhere in the United States and ask. My guess would be New York runs a surplus, but I could be wrong. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. No one cares if Mississippi is running a current account deficit. Nobody keeps track. We don't have a Mississippi central bank for good reason. We decided not to do it that way because then it would be too obvious. You would know which states run current account deficits if each state had its own central bank. In Europe, every state has its own central bank. You can keep track. You know exactly which ones are running current account deficits. It's a crazy thing to do. You should only have one central bank, like we do in the United States. Now, it's true, we have 12 district banks, I know. But they're not one state. They're many states. We did it on purpose. Okay? In a way, it was a brilliant way to set it up. So another solution is, if you want a monetary union, you need a fiscal union, which is what we have. That's why we don't care if Mississippi runs current account deficits, because Uncle Sam makes up the difference by spending more in Mississippi, so that they can keep running their current account deficits forever, as long as there's always a flow of funds from Washington to Mississippi. Okay, in Euroland, what you really fear, other than these financial flows, which, as I said, Target 2 gives you a lot of slop, so you can run current account deficits. What you really care about is the loss of jobs. So Italy had a big current account surplus. Germany had a current account deficit when they started, as I showed you. What happened to Italy? They lost their exports. Okay, they couldn't compete with the Germans. What did that mean? They lost their jobs. That's the problem. You lose jobs when you run current account deficits. That's why all countries want to do something that's completely irrational, which is run current account surpluses. Produce stuff so other people get to enjoy them, because they're so worried about their jobs. All the debates in the United States, every debate is always about, will we get more jobs or lose jobs, right? So it's all about the jobs. So if you solve that problem, then again, it wouldn't matter. If you had an employer of last resort program all through Europe, so that any Greek who wanted to work could have a job, no one would care what the current account deficit or surplus is. So it all comes down to the jobs. Other questions? Yep.
So you mentioned a lot of ways that we can theoretically save the euro. Is the euro worth saving? So I was in Europe for 3.5 months, and the two things that I really liked were Schengen and the euro. It's like you go basically anywhere, and I need my passport.
Yep.
So is that benefit for tourists worth worth a couple of different things to fix the end?
Of course not. I lived in Italy at the time, and so this was their big argument about why Italians should want to join the euro. Saying, this is stupid. I mean, we didn't even have iPhones then. With iPhones, do you actually have trouble figuring out exchange rates? You can find them minute by minute with your iPhone, and your iPhone will calculate for you, right, what you're paying in dollars. So of course not. Everyone said there will be great benefits, increased efficiency. It was all ridiculous. And in fact, it greatly increased inefficiency because you had all these old people saying, what's a euro? They're going to the store, they have no idea what it is. So it actually increased inefficiencies. No, that's not why you want the euro. Okay, why do you want the euro? If you really believe there should be something called Europe. Okay? Has a dollar union been good for the United States? I would say absolutely. Okay? The only problem in Europe is they did it wrong. They didn't do it the right way. If they had done it the right way, they'd have all the benefits that we have. I mean, we can all think of a state or two we would love to get rid of. Okay? And they'd be happy to go, but it's not going to happen. Okay? You can wish all you want about Texas, but it's not going to leave. Okay? They would love to get out too. Not going to happen. Okay? The benefits are huge of a currency union, but it has nothing to do with the exchange rates. That was just silly. Okay? It has to do with bringing the population together and creating a huge country. China is a huge country too. I mean, that's one of the reasons they're doing so well. So I think there are very big benefits to a European Union. Okay. I think that eventual monetary union probably would have been a good idea if they had done it the right way. They did it not only in the wrong way, they did it at the wrong time. Okay? The reason why they did a monetary union and not a fiscal union is that they said, we don't have a political situation where we could possibly have a fiscal union. Okay, why? Because Northern Europeans, Germans, and farther north, don't trust the Southern Europeans. We can't trust them because they'll spend too much. Okay, they're all lazy, they don't want to work, all they want is welfare. So we can't trust them to have a union like the United States has and have any kind of a democracy because they're all going to vote to spend money. Okay? So this Teutonic view. We don't trust them enough to have a fiscal union, so we're not going to do that. We're only going to have a monetary union. But you can't have a monetary union without a fiscal union because the money is all tied up with fiscal authority. That's the fundamental problem. They thought, well, we'll have a monetary union, we'll put the ECB in charge, which is a fundamentally anti-democratic institution. So is the Fed. And we see how that works out. The problem now is that the experience of having the monetary union without a fiscal union has increased the hostility. They thought gradually over time people will learn to live together and get along and all that. Exactly moved in the opposite direction, right? So now you have separatist movements all over Southern Europe. You have fascist movements all over Southern Europe. Right now the left wing is winning. But if the left wing is defeated, the right wing is going to come into power. Okay? And they are all hostile to the idea of Europe. So if anything, they've increased the hostility throughout Europe because of the way they set it up. They did it wrong. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, so if the situation, this experiment has failed so hugely, other countries that are currently not in the European Union, only in Europe, want to join, right? I don't know exactly, but I think that upon campus membership is Turkey. Why would they want to join? This is not like that.
Okay, there are benefits of getting in. Okay, no trade barriers, people can move, and that's very attractive. If you are a much lower wage country, there also are benefits in terms of getting factories sited in your country. So it could also bring jobs in. So I think if you are low cost enough and there is a reasonable chance that you can get some jobs out of it, it sort of makes sense to be for it. When I lived in Italy, almost every Italian economist, no matter how left-wing they were, wanted to join the euro. Okay, and the main reason was because they thought that their own government needed constraints. And they were happy to come under the finger of Germany. They thought it would be good. Okay, I think a lot of them have revised their position now. But they thought it would be good to have German Teutonic discipline over their governments. Because, yes, it's true, they had some problems of corruption. with the exception of the Communist Party, all the other parties in Italy were heavily into corruption. And that's another reason why countries want to get in. And just the final thing, a lot of them don't understand what I'm talking about. Okay, they don't understand, okay, there's a three-sector balance out there, okay? That giving up your currency and constraining your government means that you either have to win at the current account with a current account surplus, or your private sector has to deficit spend, which is unsustainable. It's unsustainable to have a private sector that spends more than its income. Eventually, you will get the Minsky financial instability and a crisis. They don't understand that. Okay, they think it's like Lake Wobegon. Everybody can run a surplus. Government can run a surplus. Private sector can run a surplus, and we could probably even get away with a current account deficit. Well, it can't happen. Balances do balance in the aggregate. Yeah. Were you going to say something? Yeah.
To be honest, I'm very suspicious of the future of the European Union as a whole, as a united entity. The difference is just too much. Like, not only difference between the north and the south, there's also difference between the west and the east. I had traveled throughout the Eastern European region.
Mm-hmm.
I had heard voice from Russia, Yugoslavia, Sofia. They are opposed to Germany now, and their suspicious level is even as high as their suspicious level to the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
Those countries, they have been left behind for so long behind the Iron Curtain. Now they want to catch up. They want to break the status quo established by Germany. So there's a heavy call for greater integration
Mhm.
between the Eastern European region instead of like closer integration throughout Europe. So do you think that European Union as what it is now will hold for the future?
Well, okay, the crisis has made the politics much worse. Okay, so I already said that. I completely agree with that. Because of the crisis, the hostility is greater than it was before. On the other hand, I don't know how much you travel around the U.S. We've been together for a very long time in the United States. We've been a monetary union, one nation, for centuries. And there is still a fair amount of hostility and big differences around the country. Okay? Even after more than 200 years. And so I think you can have a union with people who are pretty different. And they will become more similar over time, which Americans have become too. And you can move toward a union of very different peoples. That said, I'm also skeptical. Saving the EMU versus exiting the EMU, maybe it's 50-50 now. I still think that Europe will stumble through this because the majority of Europeans still want to remain in, even in Greece. So the party that was just elected has about 80% support. Okay, and many people outside Greece hoped that they actually would use as their bargaining chip, we're going to leave. Okay, and then Giannis says, we're not going to leave. Okay. So he starts the bargaining process, we're not going to leave. Okay, so that disappointed a lot of his supporters, but 80% of Greeks want to stay in. Okay, no matter how bad things are, they want to stay in. So I still would put 51% on as the probability that they're going to stumble through this and find some kind of solution. Yeah.
So I noticed that most of your graphs ended at 2011,
Mm.
and I was just wondering if there was a reason why. And did that, I mean,
I don't know, I probably lost an assistant to update those. No, there's no reason other than that's when the graph was done, 2012. Any other questions? Yep.
I think we're seeing ECBs trying to save the monetary union now with their quantitative easing program that they just announced. Do you think that this will just exacerbate the problem?
Quantitative easing won't do anything. Didn't do anything in the United States, won't do anything there. All it is an asset swap. So banks, instead of holding treasuries, banks are going to hold reserves. It lowers bank earnings a little bit. Other than that, it doesn't really have any impact. Now, if the ECB went out and said we're going to buy Greek debt, okay, directly buy Greek debt at a very low interest rate, yeah, that would help. So if we could get I think the majority of Greek debt now is official institution balance sheets, actually. So it's already out of the European banks. So the European banks have been effectively saved. But the Greek banks still have it. So if the ECB would go out and buy the rest of it, yeah, that would help. Yeah.
So actually, about that, for the QE that the Fed did in 2008, what do you think what's going to happen in the future? I've actually been wondering about what the impact for financial markets would be if the government decides to let go of the assets or.
Well, this will be absolutely smooth. It will have no impact on the economy. The Fed will just start selling them back. Banks are sitting there holding excess reserves. And the Fed will just say, let's switch back. Okay. All that happened before it's like you have a checking account and a saving account at your bank. QE was, let's move the money out of your savings account into your checking account. Is that going to change your behavior a lot? No. Okay. Now your bank says, tell you what, let's move the money out of your checking account back into your savings account. Is it going to change your behavior? No. That's all the Fed is doing. You know that treasuries actually are just a savings account at the Fed? In truth, that's what they really are. They just pay a slightly higher interest rate. That's all they do. Now, the Fed also bought a lot of mortgage-backed securities. If the Fed had bought the trashiest mortgage-backed securities that don't have a government guarantee behind them, then that effectively saved the banks. Because they were holding mortgage-backed securities they might lose money on, and now they're all at the Fed. The Fed will have to suffer the loss because no one's going to buy them back. That could be construed as a bank bailout. The Fed says it didn't do that. The Fed says it only bought government-guaranteed mortgage-backed securities. So no matter how trashy they are, the banks couldn't have lost anyway. And there'd be no reason not to buy them back because they're government-guaranteed. So the mortgage-backed securities add a tiny bit of a complication to QE. But the Fed's own estimates are that the first two phases of QE lowered the long-term treasury rate by 16 basis points. It's nothing, okay? And so there's no reason to believe that had any positive impact on the economy. Last question. Is there one more? Yes? Well, a falling euro actually, in the short run, helps Germany, because now they can sell more outside of Europe, because it becomes cheaper for Americans to buy BMWs when the euro goes down. There's zero, I mean really zero chance of hyperinflation or even moderate inflation in Europe. Okay, in the foreseeable future, their problems are all deflation. Okay, there's no inflation pressures at all, and it won't matter if the euro goes down. It's not going to have much impact. It does increase the price of oil, but the deflationary pressures are so great, there's absolutely no chance of Zimbabwe. Not going to happen. Now, many people think that hyperinflation comes from very big budget deficits. Well, the euro land is designed so that you really can't run big budget deficits. So there's no chance of that fueling hyperinflation either. For Germany, even when the euro was at its peak, $1.40 or whatever, the euro is still undervalued for Germany, because Germany increased productivity so much and held wages constant after one of the big things that helped Germany was East Germany coming in with very low wages. So that helped to moderate wage pressure in Germany, which is one of the reasons why they could defeat Italy and everybody else, where they had wage increases. So for Germany, the euro was already undervalued, which is one of the reasons they can export. And further devaluation will help them. Now, is the euro on a path to continual devaluation? No, not at all. It's not. Crises in Greece or Italy don't have big impacts on the euro. Okay? Has big impacts on the interest rates in Greece and Italy, but it doesn't have big impacts on the euro. The euro is hard to get. It's a currency that's very hard to get, because Europe as a whole, as I showed, doesn't run current account deficits with the rest of the world. So you can't earn euros by exporting to Europe. You can only get euros by borrowing them. Okay, you can only go into debt to get euros. I don't know, I'm confusing some people here. There's two ways to get a foreign currency. Okay, if you want dollars, how do you get them? You export to the US. Is that a fairly easy thing to do? Yes, it is. It's very easy to export to the US. We run big current account deficits. So anyone who wants dollars can export to the US and get them. But Europe as a whole, Euroland as a whole, does not import. So you can't earn euros. You can only borrow them. That keeps currencies strong. Well, and their governments are constrained in their budget deficits. Okay? Are we over?